The morning air was cool and quiet as a young woman named Alara walked down the narrow street toward the small community center where she taught piano lessons. The town was not famous. Most people outside the area had never even heard its name. It was a place where everybody knew each other, where shop owners greeted customers by name, and where life moved at a gentle pace. Alara liked it that way. Every morning she passed the same bakery, the same flower stand, and the same old clock tower in the center of town. The bakery owner always waved at her through the window. Sometimes he handed her a warm roll before she continued on her way. "Big day today?" he asked whenever he saw her carrying a stack of music books. "Every day is a big day when children are learning music," she would reply with a smile. That morning was no different. When she reached the community center, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of polished wood greeted her. In the corner of the room stood an old piano. Its surface had scratches and marks from years of use, but to Alara it was beautiful. She gently ran her fingers across the keys. The piano was one of the few things she had inherited from her grandfather. Years earlier, when she was still a little girl, she had spent countless afternoons sitting beside him as he played. He was never a famous musician. He never performed in grand concert halls. Yet everyone in town respected him because of the joy he brought through music. He believed that music was not about applause. "It's about touching hearts," he often told her. Those words had stayed with her. Even now, years after his passing, she could still hear his voice whenever she sat at a piano. Soon the room filled with children arriving for their lessons. One boy rushed in carrying his music book upside down. A young girl followed, excited to show Alara a song she had been practicing all week. The next few hours passed quickly. Alara patiently guided every student. She celebrated their small victories and encouraged them when they made mistakes. "Try again," she would say, and when they tried again, she smiled. The children loved learning from her because she never made them feel embarrassed. By lunchtime, the lessons were over. The room became quiet again. Alara sat alone at the piano and began practicing. Her fingers moved smoothly across the keys. The melody filled the empty hall. Outside, a few people stopped near the open window just to listen. It happened often. Whenever Alara played, people seemed drawn to the music. She closed her eyes and lost herself in the piece. For a few minutes, nothing else existed. No worries, no responsibilities, just music. When the final note faded, she opened her eyes and noticed someone standing near the doorway. It was the town librarian. "You never stop surprising me," the woman said. Alara laughed softly. "I'm only practicing. If that is practice, I can't imagine what a real performance sounds like." The librarian handed her a small envelope. "This arrived for you." Alara looked at it curiously. There was no return address. Only her name written neatly on the front. "Thank you," she said. The librarian nodded and left. For several moments, Alara simply stared at the envelope. She wasn't expecting any letters. Carefully, she opened it. Inside was a formal invitation. At first, she thought she had misunderstood what she was reading. She read it again. Then a third time. Her heart began beating faster. The letter explained that she had been selected as one of the winners of a national music competition she had entered months earlier. She remembered recording her audition late one evening after finishing work. She had submitted it and almost forgotten about it. Thousands of musicians had applied. She never expected anything to come from it. Yet there it was in black and white. She had won. But that was not all. The letter continued. As part of the award, she was being invited to perform at a prestigious royal cultural gala in the capital city. Alara blinked several times. The capital city. The royal gala. The words seemed unreal. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the paper. She looked around the empty room as if someone might suddenly appear and tell her it was a joke. But nobody came. The letter was real. A smile slowly spread across her face. Then came another feeling. Fear. The event would be attended by important guests from across the country. Government officials, artists, cultural leaders, people who had spent their entire lives around world-class music. What if she made a mistake? What if she disappointed everyone? What if she wasn't good enough? The questions rushed into her mind one after another. For a moment, excitement gave way to doubt. She folded the letter and placed it carefully back into the envelope. Then she walked home. Her small house sat near the edge of town. The garden outside was filled with flowers that her grandfather had planted years ago. As she stepped through the front door, she placed the envelope on the kitchen table. She stared at it. Then she made tea. Then she stared at it again. Finally, she laughed at herself. "You're acting as if it might disappear," she said aloud. That evening, several close friends visited. The moment they heard the news, the house exploded with excitement. "You have to go. This is incredible. Do you know how many musicians dream about opportunities like this?" One friend nearly spilled a cup of tea while celebrating. Another insisted that the entire town would be watching. Alara smiled, but deep inside she still felt nervous. "What if I'm not ready?" she asked. The room became quiet. An older neighbor looked at her kindly. "Do you remember how many times your grandfather performed in the town square?" "Of course. Was he ever afraid?" "Sometimes." The neighbor nodded. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to continue despite it." Those words stayed with her long after everyone had gone home. That night she sat alone at the piano. Moonlight streamed through the window. The house was silent except for the ticking of a clock. She placed the invitation on the music stand. For several minutes she simply looked at it. Then she began to play. The notes flowed gently into the quiet room. She imagined the grand hall in the capital city. She imagined hundreds of people listening. She imagined the pressure, the expectations, the uncertainty. Her fingers hesitated. One wrong note echoed through the room. She stopped. A sigh escaped her lips. For a moment doubt returned. Then her eyes fell upon an old photograph sitting nearby. It showed her grandfather smiling beside the same piano. The picture was faded with age. Yet the warmth in his expression remained. Slowly, Alara smiled back. She remembered something he used to say whenever she became frustrated. "Trust the music." Simple words, but powerful ones. She took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys again. This time she played without worrying about mistakes, without worrying about judges, without worrying about what others might think. She simply played from the heart. The music felt different, stronger, more honest. When she finished, she knew one thing for certain. She could not turn down the invitation. The opportunity was too important. The next morning, she wrote her acceptance. A few days later, preparations began. The community center organized a small farewell gathering. Children brought handmade cards. Parents offered encouragement. Even people who barely knew her stopped to wish her luck. The entire town seemed proud. As the departure day approached, excitement spread through the community. For many residents, Alara represented something bigger than herself. She was proof that dreams could grow even in small places. Finally, the morning arrived. A train waited at the station. Friends and neighbors gathered to see her off. Some waved small flags. Others carried flowers. The station felt unusually crowded. Alara hugged everyone goodbye. As she stepped onto the train, emotions filled her heart. Excitement, gratitude, hope, and yes, a little fear. The train whistle sounded. Slowly it began moving. The familiar streets started disappearing behind her. Ahead lay the capital city. Ahead lay the biggest stage she had ever seen. Ahead lay a journey that would change her life in ways she could never imagine. As the train rolled toward the horizon, Alara looked out the window and held her grandfather's old music notebook tightly in her hands. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same lesson he had taught her years ago. Trust the music. The train arrived in the capital city just after sunrise. As Alara stepped onto the platform, she immediately felt the difference between this place and her hometown. Everything seemed bigger. The station itself looked like a palace made of glass and stone. People hurried in every direction carrying briefcases, suitcases, and phones pressed against their ears. Loud announcements echoed from speakers overhead while trains arrived and departed every few minutes. For a moment, Alara simply stood still. She held her small travel bag tightly and looked around. Back home, she could walk from one end of town to the other in less than 30 minutes. Here, the station alone felt larger than several streets from her hometown combined. A nervous smile appeared on her face. "This is really happening," she whispered. Outside the station, a car sent by the Royal Arts Foundation was waiting for her. The driver greeted her politely and helped place her luggage in the back. As they drove through the city, Alara looked out the window with amazement. Tall buildings stretched toward the sky. Historic monuments stood beside modern structures. Beautiful gardens appeared between busy streets. Everything felt alive. The driver noticed her curiosity. "First time in the capital?" he asked. "Yes. You'll never forget it." Alara believed him. After nearly 30 minutes, they arrived at a beautiful hotel near the center of the city. The building was elegant without being flashy. Large windows overlooked a river that flowed through the heart of the capital. Inside, the lobby was filled with musicians, artists, and guests who had come for the upcoming gala. Some wore expensive clothing. Others carried instrument cases. Everyone seemed confident. Alara suddenly felt very ordinary. She checked in and was shown to her room. The room itself was larger than her entire living room back home. Fresh flowers sat near the window. A welcome basket rested on the table. On top of it was a schedule for the week. Her performance was only 3 days away. 3 days. The number felt both close and far away at the same time. After unpacking, she sat by the window and looked at the city below. Part of her wanted to feel excited. Another part felt overwhelmed. So many talented people were here. What if she was the least experienced musician in the entire event? The thought lingered in her mind. Later that afternoon, participants were invited to attend a welcome gathering at the Royal Cultural Center. The building stood near the river and was known throughout the country for hosting major artistic events. When Alara arrived, she almost stopped walking. The structure was breathtaking. Large stone columns lined the entrance. Beautiful flags waved in the breeze. Photographers moved around the area while guests arrived in elegant vehicles. She took a slow breath before entering. Inside, the grand hall sparkled under massive chandeliers. Soft music played in the background. Groups of guests stood together talking and laughing. Many seemed to already know one another. Alara quietly walked through the crowd, trying not to attract attention. She introduced herself to a few other musicians. Most were friendly. A violinist from the northern region shared stories about performing in different countries. A cellist spoke about years of training at prestigious academies. Listening to them made Alara admire their accomplishments. It also made her feel slightly intimidated. Compared to them, her experience seemed small. Still, she reminded herself why she was there. The competition judges had selected her for a reason. She needed to trust that. As the evening continued, organizers welcomed everyone and explained the schedule. There would be rehearsals, interviews, and formal events leading up to the gala. Then came the announcement everyone seemed to be waiting for. A famous royal music critic would attend the performance. The moment his name was mentioned, the room reacted. Some guests looked excited. Others looked nervous. Everyone seemed familiar with him. Alara wasn't. She quietly asked the violinist standing nearby. "Who is he?" The musician looked surprised. "You've never heard of him?" She shook her head. The violinist lowered his voice. "He's probably the most influential music critic in the country." "Really?" "Absolutely. One positive review from him can change a career overnight." "And a negative review?" The violinist laughed nervously. "Let's just say nobody wants one." The answer made Alara uneasy. That night, after returning to her hotel room, she searched through information provided by the event organizers. She found several articles discussing the critic. His reviews were famous. His opinions carried enormous influence. People respected his knowledge. They also feared his honesty. Some described him as brilliant. Others described him as harsh. One phrase appeared repeatedly. "He accepts nothing less than excellence." Alara closed the booklet. Her stomach tightened slightly. She wondered what he would think of her performance. The next morning began with rehearsal. The concert hall was even more impressive than she had imagined. Rows upon rows of seats stretched across the room. Balconies rose high above the stage. Golden details decorated the walls. At the center stood a magnificent grand piano. The instrument looked almost perfect. As she approached it, she felt both excitement and respect. She gently touched the keys. The sound was rich and beautiful. Unlike the old piano back home, every note seemed to shine. For the next hour she practiced quietly. The hall remained mostly empty. Only a few staff members moved around preparing for the event. For the first time since arriving in the city, she felt calm. Music had always been her safe place. Whenever doubts appeared, the piano helped silence them. As she finished a piece, applause suddenly echoed from the back of the hall. Startled, she turned around. Several people had entered without her noticing. Among them stood an older man wearing an elegant dark suit. His expression was serious. He watched her carefully. One of the organizers immediately approached him. Others followed. The room's atmosphere changed. People seemed eager to impress him. Alara quickly realized who he was. The famous critic. Even from a distance, his presence commanded attention. He slowly walked through the hall while speaking with organizers. At one point, his eyes moved toward the stage. Toward her. For only a second, their eyes met. Then he looked away. The moment was brief. Yet it somehow left Alara uncomfortable. She couldn't explain why. The rehearsal ended shortly afterward. As she packed her music, she overheard several conversations nearby. Musicians discussed previous reviews the critic had written. Some praised his expertise. Others complained about his strict standards. One performer quietly admitted that a negative review years earlier had nearly ended his confidence. Alara listened but said nothing. She preferred focusing on her music rather than opinions. Still, it was impossible not to feel the pressure. The following day brought another rehearsal and a formal reception. This gathering was much larger. Important guests from across the country attended. Artists, cultural leaders, business figures, and members of distinguished families filled the venue. Alara wore a simple but elegant dress. Compared to many guests, her appearance was modest. She didn't mind. She had never cared much about expensive fashion. What mattered to her was the music. As she entered the reception hall, conversations filled the room. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the lights. Servers moved gracefully between groups of guests. Everything felt polished and sophisticated. For a while, Alara stood near a display of historical photographs connected to the country's musical heritage. She enjoyed reading about the musicians who had come before her. Many had overcome enormous challenges to pursue their dreams. Their stories inspired her. While she was studying one photograph, a conversation nearby caught her attention. Several guests were speaking with the royal critic. He stood at the center of the group. People listened closely to every word he said. His reputation clearly gave him influence. At first, Alara paid little attention. Then she heard someone mention the upcoming gala performers. The group began discussing which musicians they expected to impress the audience. Names were mentioned. Predictions were made. Then someone brought up the young pianist from a small town. Alara immediately realized they were talking about her. She remained where she was, hoping not to be noticed. One guest smiled politely. "I've heard wonderful things about her audition." The critic gave a small shrug. Auditions and grand stages are very different things. A few people laughed. Another guest asked whether he expected any surprises. The critic glanced toward the room. His eyes briefly landed on Alara. Recognition appeared immediately. Then came a faint smile. Not a warm smile, a doubtful one. "Sometimes events like these favor inspiring stories over proven experience," he said. The comment was not openly cruel. Yet the meaning felt clear. Several guests exchanged looks. A few nodded in agreement. Alara suddenly felt very small. She looked away before anyone could notice her reaction. The conversation continued behind her. But she no longer wanted to hear it. Quietly, She walked toward a nearby balcony overlooking the river. The evening air felt cooler outside. She stood alone for several minutes. The city lights reflected on the water below. Her excitement from arriving in the capital now mixed with uncertainty. The critic had not directly insulted her. Yet she could feel his doubt. Maybe others felt the same way. Maybe they looked at her simple background and wondered whether she belonged here at all. For a moment, the old fears returned. But then she remembered the children she taught back home. She remembered the townspeople who had gathered at the train station. She remembered her grandfather's words. Trust the music. Slowly, she straightened her shoulders. The gala was approaching. People could think whatever they wanted. They could doubt her, question her, even underestimate her. None of that could change what would happen once she sat at the piano. And as she looked across the glowing city, she quietly made herself a promise. When the performance finally arrived, she would give the audience every piece of her heart, no matter who was watching. The morning of the gala arrived faster than Alara expected. When she opened the curtains in her hotel room, the city was already awake. Sunlight reflected from the river below, and people filled the streets. Cars moved steadily through the avenues while pedestrians hurried toward their destinations. For most of the city, it was just another day. For Alara, it was the biggest day of her life. She stood quietly by the window for several moments. A mixture of excitement and nervousness filled her chest. Months earlier, she had been teaching children in a small community center. Now she was preparing to perform before some of the most important people in the country. The journey still felt unreal. After breakfast, she went through her music one final time. She had practiced every piece countless times. Every note, every transition, every pause. Still, she checked everything again. Not because she doubted her preparation, because performing mattered to her. She wanted to give her best. By late afternoon, the city seemed to transform. Large banners for the Royal Cultural Gala decorated the streets surrounding the concert hall. Guests began arriving from every direction. Television crews prepared outside. Photographers gathered near the entrance. The event attracted attention every year, but this year seemed especially important. Several major anniversaries connected to the nation's artistic heritage were being celebrated. Inside the hall, staff members moved quickly. Final preparations were underway. Fresh flowers decorated the stage. Rows of seats stretched toward the back of the grand auditorium. The beautiful piano sat beneath warm lighting, waiting silently. Alara arrived earlier than required. She preferred having time to settle her thoughts. A staff member guided her to a waiting area reserved for performers. Several musicians were already there. Some chatted casually. Others reviewed sheet music. A few sat alone, concentrating quietly. Everyone dealt with pressure differently. Alara found a peaceful corner and took a seat. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she imagined her hometown. The old community center. The children laughing during lessons. The bakery owner waving every morning. The familiar streets. Thinking about home always helped her feel grounded. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. One of the organizers entered. "There will be a short reception before the performance begins," the organizer explained. Several guests would like to meet some of the performers. Alara nodded politely. Within minutes, she joined a gathering in one of the hall's reception rooms. The room was filled with conversation. Elegant clothing, polished smiles, important guests discussing art, culture, and music. At first everything seemed pleasant. Then she noticed the critic. He stood near the center of the room surrounded by guests. As before, people listened carefully whenever he spoke. His reputation clearly carried weight. Several younger musicians appeared nervous whenever he approached. Alara hoped to avoid attention. Unfortunately, that plan didn't last long. One of the organizers spotted her. "There she is," he announced warmly. A few people turned. Then several more. Within seconds, conversations shifted toward her. The organizer smiled proudly. "Our youngest featured pianist." Polite applause followed. Alara thanked everyone and tried to remain relaxed. Most guests greeted her kindly. A few asked about her hometown. Others asked how she began playing piano. She answered honestly and appreciated their interest. Then someone addressed the critic. "What are your thoughts about tonight's new talent?" The room became noticeably quieter. People waited for his response. The critic glanced toward Alara. For a second she hoped he might offer encouragement. Instead, he gave a measured smile. "Talent is a word we use very freely these days." A few people chuckled. Alara felt her stomach tighten. The critic continued. "Winning a competition is certainly impressive. But great performances are not measured by potential. They are measured by what happens on stage." More quiet laughter followed. The words were polite on the surface. Yet everyone understood the message. He wasn't convinced. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others seemed entertained. Alara forced herself to smile. She didn't want anyone seeing how much the comment affected her. Another guest attempted to ease the tension. "I'm sure she'll do wonderfully." The critic lifted his shoulders. "We shall see." The conversation moved on. But the damage had already been done. Several people began looking at Alara differently. Not with admiration, with curiosity, as if they were waiting to discover whether she would succeed or fail. The feeling was impossible to ignore. For the next hour she remained professional. She answered questions. She smiled when spoken to. She thanked guests for their kind words. Yet inside, her confidence had begun to shake. The critic's remarks kept replaying in her mind. "We shall see." Such simple words. Yet they carried doubt. As the reception ended, performers returned backstage to prepare. The atmosphere grew more serious. Soon the audience would begin entering the auditorium. Soon the performances would begin. Alara changed into her concert attire and carefully adjusted everything one final time. Another pianist sat nearby reviewing notes. A violinist quietly tuned her instrument. Nobody spoke much. The pressure was becoming real. From backstage, faint sounds drifted in from the auditorium. Guests were arriving. Seats were filling. Conversations echoed through the hall. The event was beginning. A stage coordinator entered with a schedule. Performers reviewed their positions. Alara was scheduled to perform later in the evening. Part of her appreciated having extra time. Another part wished she could perform immediately and get it over with. Waiting often felt harder than performing. Minutes turned into an hour. The gala officially began. A host welcomed the audience. Opening performances followed. Applause repeatedly echoed through the building. Each successful performance increased both excitement and pressure. Eventually, Alara stepped quietly into the wings to watch part of the program. The audience looked enormous from the stage entrance. Hundreds of faces filled the seats. Important guests occupied the front rows. Members of distinguished families sat nearby. Cultural leaders and sponsors filled entire sections. Then she noticed the critic. He sat near the center, perfectly positioned to observe every detail. Even from a distance, his presence felt significant. She quickly looked away. A few performances later, a short intermission began. Guests stood and stretched. Some moved into the lobby. Others remained seated. Backstage, performers prepared for the second half of the evening. Alara reviewed her music once more. Then she overheard a conversation nearby. Two guests who had wandered near the backstage entrance were talking quietly. Unfortunately, they were not quiet enough. "I heard she's from a tiny town." "So did I." "Seems unusual for an event like this." "Perhaps they're trying to create an inspiring story." Both laughed softly. Alara pretended not to hear, but every word reached her clearly. A painful feeling settled inside her. For years she had worked hard, practiced faithfully, studied whenever possible. Yet some people seemed more interested in where she came from than what she could do. The realization hurt. A stage assistant noticed her expression. "You okay?" Alara quickly nodded. "Just thinking." The assistant smiled kindly. "Don't think too much. Everyone gets nervous." The advice was simple, yet somehow comforting. Soon the second half of the gala began. One by one, performers took the stage. The audience remained engaged. Applause continued. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. Then, shortly before Alera's scheduled performance, an unexpected moment occurred. The host briefly mentioned the competition that had selected several young artists. As part of the introduction, a large screen displayed photographs and information about the winners. When Alera's image appeared, polite applause followed. Most people simply smiled, but somewhere in the audience, a few scattered voices reacted differently. The comments were not loud enough to hear clearly, yet they carried a dismissive tone. Several audience members exchanged amused looks. Others whispered among themselves. The atmosphere shifted slightly, only slightly, but enough for Alera to notice. She stood backstage watching it happen. A strange loneliness washed over her. For the first time since arriving in the capital, she wondered whether she truly belonged here. Perhaps the critic had been right. Perhaps people expected more experience, more prestige, a more impressive background. The doubts grew stronger. Her hands suddenly felt cold. Her breathing became shallow. The noise of the audience seemed distant. For a brief moment, fear threatened to take control. Then something unexpected happened. One of the stage workers approached. He was an older man who had been helping throughout rehearsals. He handed her a small bottle of water. "You look worried." She laughed nervously. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." He sat beside her. "You know, I've worked in this hall for almost 30 years. "Really?" He nodded. "I've seen famous musicians perform here. Some were brilliant. Some were disappointing." Alera listened carefully. The man smiled. "Want to know the difference?" She nodded. "The best performers stop worrying about proving themselves." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "They focus on sharing something meaningful." The words reminded her of her grandfather. Almost exactly. The man stood and adjusted a curtain. People can argue about backgrounds, titles, and reputations all day, but when genuine music reaches the audience, none of that matters. For a moment, Alera said nothing. Then she smiled. "Thank you." The stage worker nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, the coordinator returned. "It's almost time." Her heart immediately began racing again. The audience continued applauding for the previous performer. Soon the applause faded. The host stepped forward. A brief introduction followed. Then came her name. The audience responded with polite applause. Not loud, not enthusiastic, just polite. Alera stood. This was the moment. Everything had led here. The long hours of practice, the sacrifices, the journey from her small hometown, the doubts, the criticism, the whispers, all of it. She took one slow breath, then another, and as she prepared to walk toward the stage, she remembered the promise she had made to herself while standing on the balcony overlooking the city. People could doubt her if they wanted. That was their choice. Her job was not to fight the doubt. Her job was to sit at the piano and let the music speak. With that thought in her heart, she stepped forward toward the bright lights waiting beyond the curtain. The bright stage lights felt warmer than Alera expected. As she stepped onto the stage, hundreds of eyes turned toward her. The enormous concert hall suddenly seemed even larger. Rows upon rows of people filled the seats. Elegant balconies overlooked the stage from above. The grand piano waited at the center under a soft golden spotlight. For a brief moment, everything felt silent. Then polite applause echoed through the hall. Alera smiled and bowed respectfully. She could feel her heartbeat racing. The audience's faces blended together under the lights, but certain figures stood out. Important guests occupied the front rows. Members of distinguished families sat nearby, and almost directly ahead sat the critic. His expression revealed nothing. No encouragement, no excitement, only quiet observation. Alera looked away. She reminded herself why she was there. Not to impress him, not to prove anyone wrong. She was there because she loved music. Slowly, she sat at the piano bench. Her hands rested gently above the keys. The room grew completely still. Every whisper disappeared. Every movement stopped. The audience waited. Alera took a deep breath and began. The opening notes floated softly through the hall. A beautiful melody filled the space. Warm, gentle, confident. Within moments, the nervousness began fading. The piano felt familiar, comforting, like an old friend. The more she played, the more relaxed she became. Years of practice guided her fingers naturally. The audience listened attentively. Several guests leaned forward in their seats. Others closed their eyes. The music seemed to create its own world. A world where expectations and doubts no longer mattered. When the first piece ended, applause followed. Stronger than before. Not overwhelming, but sincere. Alara smiled. A small sense of relief settled inside her. The performance was going well. She continued with the next selection. Again, the audience responded warmly. For the first time that evening, she felt truly connected to them. The music was doing exactly what her grandfather had always said it could do. It was touching hearts. After finishing her scheduled program, she stood and bowed once more. The applause continued. Several people rose briefly from their seats. A few voices called out words of praise. The evening appeared to be unfolding perfectly. Then something unexpected happened. As Alara prepared to leave the stage, the host approached. The audience gradually quieted. The host smiled warmly. What a wonderful performance! The audience applauded again. Before our next performer begins, the host continued, we have a few moments remaining in the program. The audience listened attentively. The host turned toward Alara. Would you be willing to answer a few questions? Alara hesitated briefly before nodding. The host handed her a microphone. Most of the questions were simple. How long had she been playing? Who inspired her? What did music mean to her? She answered honestly. The audience seemed to appreciate her sincerity. Then a guest from the front row stood and asked a question. What inspired you to enter the national competition? Alara smiled. She thought for a moment. Then she answered. Many people inspired me. Teachers, friends, my grandfather. But I was also inspired by stories of people who believed young artists deserved opportunities. The audience listened quietly. She continued. When I was younger, I often read articles about musicians and supporters of the arts. Those stories helped me keep going during difficult times. The answer seemed simple enough. Yet it triggered a reaction from someone nearby. One of the older guests looked surprised. Do you mean the articles written by Lady Eleanor? Alara immediately smiled. Yes. A few people exchanged glances. The name clearly meant something important. The host looked interested. You've read her work? Many times. The audience grew quieter. Alara spoke naturally. When I was younger, our town library had a collection of essays about music and culture. Lady Eleanor often wrote about supporting young artists from ordinary backgrounds. Several guests nodded. The host smiled. Her writings were very respected. They helped me more than she probably ever imagined. The audience responded with warm applause. Meanwhile, several rows away, the critic sat completely still. His expression changed slightly. Only slightly, but enough for those nearby to notice. Lady Eleanor had been his mother. Everyone in the cultural world knew that. Years earlier, she had become famous for supporting talented young artists, regardless of their social status or financial background. She believed talent could come from anywhere. Many musicians owed part of their success to her encouragement. After her passing, countless people continued speaking about her kindness. The host glanced toward the critic before returning attention to Alara. You seem to know quite a bit about her work. Alara nodded. I admired her very much. The room remained silent. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply telling the truth. When I felt discouraged, I sometimes read her essays again. She believed that music belonged to everyone, not just people with special advantages. Several audience members applauded. Others smiled. The atmosphere in the room felt different now. Warmer, more personal. Then one of the organizers approached the host and whispered something. The host listened carefully. A surprised smile appeared on his face. He turned back toward the audience. I've just been reminded of something interesting. Curiosity spread throughout the hall. The host continued. Tomorrow marks another anniversary connected to Lady Eleanor's legacy. Many guests nodded. The date held significance within the country's artistic community. The host turned toward Alara. If Lady Eleanor inspired you so deeply, what do you think she would say to young musicians today? The question caught her off guard. For a moment she searched for the right words. Then she answered from the heart. I think she would tell them not to measure themselves against other people. The audience listened carefully. I think she would remind them that talent grows through patience, effort, and kindness. And I think she would tell them not to let anyone convince them that their background determines their value. A ripple of applause spread through the hall. Several guests smiled. Others looked thoughtful. The critic remained silent. Yet something in his expression seemed different now. Not softer. Not exactly. But thoughtful. As the applause faded, the host thanked Alara for sharing her story. She expected the moment to end there. But another memory suddenly came to mind. Without planning to say it, she spoke again. There is one thing I never forgot from Lady Eleanor's writings. The audience grew quiet. What was it? The host asked. Alara smiled gently. She once wrote that the true purpose of music is not to make people feel small. It is to help them feel understood. The room became completely silent. No applause. No whispers. Nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that happens when words reach people deeply. Even the host seemed affected. Several audience members lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Others nodded. The statement carried a simple truth. And for many people in the room it felt especially meaningful. Across the hall, the critic's gaze remained fixed on the stage. For the first time all evening, he appeared genuinely uncomfortable. Not because of anything rude or confrontational. Because the words reminded him of someone he had lost. Someone whose values he respected. Someone whose memory still carried weight. His mother. Meanwhile, Alara remained unaware of the impact her words were having. She simply believed she was sharing something meaningful. Nothing more. The host eventually thanked her once again. Applause filled the hall. This time it sounded different. Stronger. Warmer. More heartfelt. As Alara prepared to leave the stage, she noticed several people smiling at her. Not because she had performed well. Not because she had won a competition. But because they had connected with her story. Backstage, she finally allowed herself to relax. The performance was over. The audience had been kind. Everything had gone better than she expected. She sat quietly in a chair and accepted a glass of water from a staff member. Only then did she realize how emotionally exhausting the evening had been. A few minutes later, one of the event organizers approached. You did wonderfully. Thank you. The organizer smiled. You know, there is something interesting about what happened out there. Alara looked curious. What do you mean? The organizer hesitated, then lowered his voice slightly. Very few people speak publicly about Lady Eleanor anymore. Really? He nodded. Not in the way you did. Alara looked surprised. I was only sharing my experience. That may be exactly why people responded so strongly. The organizer paused, then added something unexpected. And I think your words reached someone else as well. Before Alara could ask what he meant, the organizer was called away. She watched him leave. Then she sat quietly, thinking. Outside the dressing room, the gala continued. Guests applauded. Music filled the building. Conversations echoed through the hall. Yet somewhere among those conversations, a new connection had quietly begun forming. A connection linked to a woman who was no longer there. A woman whose beliefs had once inspired a young girl in a small town, and whose memory was about to change the course of an evening that nobody in the audience would ever forget. The gala continued late into the evening. More musicians performed. Guests applauded. Conversations filled the hall between performances. Yet for many people, something had changed after Alara's appearance on stage. Her music had impressed them, but it was her sincerity that remained in their minds. Backstage, she sat quietly in the performer's lounge. The pressure she had carried for days was finally beginning to fade. She wasn't thinking about reviews. She wasn't thinking about criticism. She simply felt grateful. Grateful that she had been given the opportunity to share her music. Grateful that the audience had listened. And grateful that she had spoken honestly about the people who inspired her. As the evening moved forward, performers and guests passed through the lounge. Several stopped to congratulate her. One elderly conductor praised her musical expression. A young violinist thanked her for speaking about self-belief. Even a few event staff members shared kind words. Every conversation made her feel a little more relaxed. Still, one person had not spoken to her. The critic. She hadn't expected him to. In truth, she preferred not to think about him at all. His comments earlier in the week had hurt more than she wanted to admit. Even though he had never directly insulted her, his doubt had been obvious. And that doubt had followed her throughout the gala. A little later, one of the organizers entered the lounge carrying a folder. He smiled when he saw Alara. "There you are. Everything okay?" she asked. "More than okay." The organizer sat beside her. "I thought you might like to see something." He opened the folder. Inside were copies of historical materials connected to the foundation sponsoring the gala. Photographs, articles, letters, programs from past events. Alara immediately became interested. She loved reading about musical history. As she carefully turned the pages, a familiar face appeared in one of the photographs. Lady Eleanor, the same woman whose writings had inspired her years ago. The photograph showed her speaking with a group of young musicians. Everyone in the picture looked happy. The organizer noticed her reaction. She believed strongly in helping young artists. Alara nodded. "I know. Not everyone remembers that." For several moments they looked through the materials together. Then something caught Alara's attention. A newspaper clipping. The article described a special event held many years earlier. Lady Eleanor had attended a concert honoring the country's cultural heritage. The article mentioned that one particular piece had always held a special place in her heart. The national hymn. Alara paused. She read the passage again. Then a second time. The organizer smiled. "Interesting, isn't it?" "It really is. She often spoke about it." The article explained how the hymn reminded Lady Eleanor of unity, service, and gratitude. She viewed it as more than music. To her, it represented shared values and collective hope. Alara continued reading. The story touched her deeply. The organizer eventually stood. "I should get back to work. Thank you for showing me this." "My pleasure." After he left, Alara remained seated with the article. Something about it stayed with her. She couldn't explain why. The words felt meaningful, personal, almost as if they were speaking directly to her. Later that evening, a small private gathering was held for performers and honored guests. The atmosphere was far more relaxed than the formal gala. People talked freely. Stories were exchanged. Laughter filled the room. Alara spent most of her time listening. She enjoyed hearing about different musical journeys. One performer described traveling across the country by bus to attend auditions. Another shared stories of practicing in tiny classrooms because proper rehearsal spaces were unavailable. The conversations reminded her that every musician faced challenges. Success rarely came easily. At one point, an older guest joined their group. The conversation eventually turned toward Lady Eleanor. Several people spoke warmly about her legacy. One guest recalled attending an event she organized decades earlier. Another described how she had personally encouraged struggling artists. Then someone mentioned her son, the critic. The mood shifted slightly. Nobody said anything negative. Yet there was an obvious difference. People respected him, but they spoke about his mother with affection. One guest sighed. She had a gift for making people feel welcome. Others nodded. Another person added, she always looked for potential, not status. Again, several people agreed. Alara listened quietly. The more she learned, the more she admired the woman. Eventually the gathering ended. Most guests returned to their hotels. Some prepared to leave the city the next morning. Alara walked back to her room feeling thoughtful. The night air was cool. The city lights reflected beautifully on the river. As she entered her hotel room, She noticed the article about Lady Eleanor still folded inside her bag. Without really thinking about it, she took it out and read it again. Then she sat at the piano located in one of the hotel's practice rooms. The room was empty, quiet, peaceful. She began playing softly. At first she played familiar melodies, then fragments of other pieces. Ideas flowed naturally. The music seemed to guide her thoughts. Eventually, almost without realizing it, her fingers drifted into the melody of the national hymn. The notes filled the room gently, simple, respectful, beautiful. She stopped playing and looked down at the keys. A strange feeling settled over her. An idea, unexpected but powerful. She played the melody again. This time she added her own interpretation. The tune became softer in some places, more emotional in others. She wasn't changing its meaning. She was simply expressing it through her own voice as a musician. The sound moved her. For nearly an hour she explored different arrangements, different harmonies, different expressions. By the end, she had created something unique, something personal, something heartfelt. The next morning, the final day of events began. Several smaller performances and cultural presentations were scheduled before the gala's closing ceremony. Although her main performance was already complete, Elara remained involved as a guest participant. Throughout the day, she continued thinking about the arrangement. The melody stayed in her mind. At lunch, she learned something surprising. One of the organizers mentioned that the closing ceremony would include a short open musical segment. Certain performers might be invited to contribute if time allowed. The possibility immediately caught her attention. She wasn't planning anything specific. Yet the idea refused to leave her thoughts. As the afternoon passed, she found herself reading more about Lady Eleanor. The foundation library contained additional materials, letters, interviews, articles. Everywhere she looked, the same themes appeared: kindness, opportunity, encouragement, support for young artists. The more she learned, the more she understood why so many people admired her. Then she discovered something else. The date of the closing ceremony carried special significance. It closely aligned with the anniversary of Lady Eleanor's passing. The realization stopped her. Suddenly everything seemed connected. The articles, the conversations, the memories people had shared, even the melody she couldn't stop thinking about. For several minutes she sat alone in silence. Then she opened her grandfather's old notebook. The same notebook she had carried from home. Inside were handwritten notes about music, advice, reflections, ideas collected over many years. One page immediately caught her attention. A sentence written in fading ink. Music becomes most powerful when it honors something greater than itself. Elara stared at the words. A slow smile appeared. The decision suddenly felt clear. She wasn't thinking about publicity, or attention, or impressing anyone. She simply wanted to honor someone whose words had helped shape her life. As evening approached, the closing ceremony began. The atmosphere was warm and celebratory. Guests seemed relaxed after several successful days of events. Performances continued. Speeches were given. Awards were presented. Then came the final portion of the program. The host stepped onto the stage. He thanked participants and guests for making the event memorable. Applause filled the hall. As it faded, the host made an unexpected announcement. We have time for one final musical contribution this evening. Audience members looked around with curiosity. Several performers exchanged surprised glances. The host smiled. A special guest has volunteered to share something meaningful. Elara felt her heartbeat quicken. This was the moment she had quietly decided upon earlier. As her name was announced, a murmur spread through the audience. Some looked surprised. Others smiled. The critic sat in his usual seat near the center of the hall. His expression revealed nothing. Slowly, Elara walked toward the stage. The same stage where she had performed before. The same piano waited beneath the lights. She sat down calmly. The hall gradually became silent. No one knew what she was about to play. No one knew why she had chosen it. And as her fingers gently settled onto the keys, A feeling of peace filled her heart. This performance was no longer about proving herself. It was about gratitude. It was about honoring a legacy. And within moments, the first notes would begin a chain of events that nobody in the hall would ever forget. The hall became completely silent. Hundreds of people watched as Alara sat alone at the piano beneath the warm stage lights. Nobody knew what she was about to play. There had been no announcement, no explanation, only a simple introduction from the host. Even the musicians sitting in the audience looked curious. For a few seconds, Alara remained still. Her hands rested gently above the keys. She took a slow breath and thought about her grandfather. She thought about her hometown. She thought about the children she taught every week. And she thought about Lady Eleanor, a woman she had never met, but whose words had guided her through some of her most difficult moments. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft and delicate. A simple melody floated through the hall. The audience listened carefully. At first, nobody seemed to recognize the tune. The arrangement was subtle, gentle, almost like a quiet conversation. The notes flowed smoothly from one phrase into the next. There was something comforting about the music. Something familiar. Several guests leaned forward in their seats. The melody slowly grew richer, warmer, more emotional. Then, little by little, people began recognizing it. A few exchanged surprised glances. Others sat up straighter. The familiar notes of the national hymn were beginning to emerge. Not in a dramatic way, not loudly, but naturally, beautifully, like a memory returning after many years. A quiet murmur moved through parts of the audience. Then the room became silent once again. Nobody wanted to miss a single note. Alara continued playing. Her version of the hymn was unlike anything most people had heard before. She wasn't simply performing the melody. She was telling a story through it. The music carried feelings of gratitude, hope, respect, and kindness. Every phrase seemed to speak directly to the audience. As the arrangement developed, the emotional atmosphere inside the hall began to change. People who had been chatting moments earlier now sat completely still. Several guests lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Others watched the stage with growing emotion. The melody seemed to touch something deep inside them. Near the center of the audience sat the critic. Earlier in the week, he had appeared confident and unshakable. Tonight, however, something was different. The moment he recognized the hymn, his expression changed. At first, it was only a small reaction, a slight tightening around his eyes. Then another. As the music continued, memories began returning. Years ago, his mother had loved this hymn. Not because it was famous. Not because tradition required it. She loved it because of what it represented. Unity, service, respect. She often spoke about those values, especially when discussing music. The critic remembered attending events with her as a young man. He remembered standing beside her during community gatherings. He remembered hearing her explain that music should bring people together, not divide them. For years those memories had remained buried beneath busy schedules, professional responsibilities, and endless public appearances. Yet now, sitting in that concert hall, they returned one by one. The music seemed to unlock them. Alara knew none of this. She simply played. Her entire focus remained on the piano. Every note came from the heart. She wasn't performing for praise. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was expressing gratitude. Nothing more. As the arrangement reached its middle section, she introduced a new variation. The familiar melody blended with softer harmonies. The sound became deeply emotional. Several audience members quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Others clasped their hands together. The atmosphere in the hall felt almost sacred. Not because of the building, not because of the event, because everyone seemed connected by the same experience. Even those who had never heard Alara play before felt it. The music carried sincerity. And sincerity has a way of reaching people. A woman seated near the front row gently dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Beside her, an elderly guest closed his eyes and listened quietly. Further back, a group of young musicians sat completely motionless. No one wanted the moment to end. Then came the section that changed everything. Several days earlier, while reading about Lady Eleanor, Alara had discovered references to a small melody the woman often loved hearing at cultural events. It was simple, almost forgotten by many people, yet it held special meaning. Alara had carefully woven a few notes of that melody into her arrangement. Not enough to change the hymn, just enough to honor the memory. When those notes appeared, the critic immediately recognized them. His eyes widened. For a second, he seemed unable to breathe. The melody belonged to his childhood. His mother used to hum it while preparing for public events. She often sang it quietly while reviewing speeches and letters. Very few people knew about it. Even fewer would recognize it. Yet somehow this young pianist had included it. Not for attention, not for applause, but out of genuine respect. The realization hit him harder than he expected. He looked toward the stage. For the first time, he wasn't seeing a competition winner or a young performer from a small town. He was seeing someone who truly understood the values his mother had spent her life promoting. The values he himself had sometimes forgotten. Meanwhile, the audience continued listening in complete silence. The emotional power of the performance kept growing. Each note seemed to carry deeper meaning. The final section approached. Alara slowed the tempo slightly. The melody became more reflective, more intimate. The hall felt frozen in time. No coughing, no whispering, no movement, only music. Then came the final phrase. Beautiful, gentle, full of feeling. Her fingers lingered on the last notes. The sound floated through the hall before gradually fading away. Silence followed. A deep silence. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The audience simply sat there absorbing what they had experienced. Alara lowered her hands. She looked at the piano, then toward the audience. The silence continued. Part of her wondered if she had made a mistake. Had she chosen the wrong piece? Had she been too emotional? Too personal? Then it happened. One person stood. Then another. Then another. Within moments, the entire audience rose to its feet. Thunderous applause filled the hall. The sound echoed from every corner of the building. People clapped enthusiastically. Some smiled through tears. Others simply nodded with admiration. The standing ovation continued, and continued, and continued. Alara looked overwhelmed. She had never experienced anything like it. Her eyes filled with emotion. She stood and bowed respectfully. The applause only grew louder. Several guests cheered. Others called out words of praise. The atmosphere was electric. Yet among all those reactions, one stood out. The critic remained standing. He continued applauding. Not politely, not because everyone else was, but sincerely. For the first time since the event began, there was no trace of doubt on his face. Only respect. The audience eventually settled back into their seats. The applause slowly faded. The host returned to the stage. Even he appeared emotional. What a remarkable performance. The audience applauded again. The host turned toward Alara. I don't think anyone here will forget that. More applause followed. Then he asked a simple question. What inspired you to perform that piece tonight? The hall grew quiet. Everyone wanted to hear the answer. Alara accepted the microphone. For a moment she searched for the right words. Then she spoke honestly. I wanted to express gratitude. The audience listened carefully. When I was younger, there were moments when I doubted myself. She smiled gently, like many young people do. Several audience members nodded. I came from a small town. Opportunities sometimes felt far away. The room remained silent. During those years, I often read the writings of Lady Eleanor. At the mention of the name, many people glanced toward the critic. Alara continued. Her words encouraged me to keep believing in the value of hard work, kindness, and music. The audience listened attentively. I never had the chance to thank her. Her voice softened slightly. But I wanted to honor her memory tonight. Silence filled the hall once more. Not uncomfortable silence. Respectful silence. Many people seemed deeply moved. The critic lowered his eyes. The emotion on his face was impossible to hide now. Everything he had heard throughout the week returned to him. His own comments, his doubts, his assumptions. He remembered judging Alara before truly knowing anything about her. He remembered questioning whether she belonged. Yet here she stood, not seeking recognition, not seeking revenge, only offering gratitude. And in that moment he realized how wrong he had been. The audience applauded warmly once again. But for the critic, the evening had become something far more personal. It was no longer about a performance. It was about a lesson. One he never expected to learn from a young pianist sitting alone at a piano. And as the applause echoed through the hall, he knew that before the night ended, there was something he needed to do.